Hello and welcome to SanDemy. This series explains housing law, standards, and the Renters' Rights Act in clear, accessible language, without getting lost in legal jargon or headlines. We're not here to give legal advice or take sides. Instead, we focus on how the housing system actually works in practice for tenants, landlords, letting agents, and local authorities. In this episode, we're looking at can landlords still evict tenants? Grounds for possession explained. Let's get started.
It is great to be back. And honestly, I think we need to dive straight into the deep end today. I've been speaking to agents and landlords all week, and the level of anxiety around this is, well, it's through the roof.
I can imagine. It's the biggest change in a generation.
It really is. The headline fear I'm hearing is that landlords are essentially losing control of their assets. There's this narrative that once a tenant is in under the new act, that's it. You can never get the property back. You're stuck. So before we get into all the technicalities, let's just answer the big question. Has the ability to evict actually disappeared?
No. Let's be absolutely clear about that right from the start. Possession does not disappear. It remains entirely lawful for a landlord to recover their property. But you're right to sense a shift. The mechanism for doing so is changing, fundamentally.
Okay, mechanism is a good word, but what does that actually look like on the ground?
Well, we're moving from a system of, termination by default.
Right, where you didn't really need a reason.
Exactly, to a system of termination by reason. Under the old Section 21 rules, a tenancy ended just because the contract said so, or a notice was served. It was administrative. Now, a tenancy only ends if the tenant chooses to leave, or if the landlord has a valid legal reason to make them leave.
Termination by reason. That phrase feels like it's doing a lot of work. So a landlord can't just wake up one morning and decide they want the property back for a change of scenery.
That's it in a nutshell. They can no longer end a tenancy just because time has passed. To get possession, they have to rely on specific statutory grounds. You have to have a valid reason defined in law, and, this is the kicker, you have to be able to prove it.
Right, so the days of no fault are gone. Every eviction now has a fault, or at least a specific cause attached to it. How messy is this list of reasons? Are we talking hundreds of loopholes, or is it structured?
It's a long list, but it's manageable. I think the easiest way is to break it down into two distinct buckets. First, you have grounds based on landlord circumstances. These are reasons where the tenant hasn't done anything wrong, but the landlord needs the property back.
Okay, the it's not you, it's me category.
Precisely. And the second bucket is tenant conduct. This is where the tenant has done something wrong, rent arrears, antisocial behavior, that kind of thing.
That distinction makes a lot of sense. But here's the question that keeps coming up. If a landlord goes to court with one of these reasons, let's say the tenant hasn't paid rent, does the judge have to grant the eviction? Or can they just say, well, yes, you haven't been paid, but I think it's unreasonable, so they can stay?
You've just hit on the most critical legal distinction in the whole act. It's the difference between mandatory grounds and discretionary grounds.
Okay, break that down for us.
If a ground is mandatory, it means that if the landlord proves the facts, proves the rent is overdue by a certain amount, for instance, the court must grant a possession order. The judge has no choice. Their hands are tied.
Right, that sounds like real security for the landlord.
It is. But if a ground is discretionary, the court looks at the evidence, accepts the facts are true, but then has to ask a second question. Is it reasonable to evict the tenant in these circumstances?
Is it reasonable? Wow, that sounds incredibly subjective.
It is. The judge will look at the whole picture. Does the tenant have children, health issues? Will they be made homeless? So for a landlord, a discretionary ground is always a bit of a gamble. You might win on the facts, but still lose the possession order on reasonableness.
That's a scary thought for a property owner. Let's dig into the practical side, starting with that first bucket. Landlord circumstances. What about the classic scenario, the accidental landlord who's been renting out their old flat and now needs to move back in?
Yes, that's absolutely still allowed, and it's a mandatory ground. This is ground one. If the landlord or their close family member needs to move into the property as their main home, they can use this ground.
Hold on, let's pause on close family member. Does that mean my second cousin or my partner who I'm not married to? Because families can be complicated.
The law is actually quite strict here to stop people abusing it. Close family generally means a spouse, civil partner, parent, or a child. It doesn't usually extend to cousins or friends. The idea is to stop landlords just finding a distant relative as an excuse.
Okay, so immediate family. Are there restrictions? Can I sign a tenancy today and then next week say, oops, sorry, my son needs the flat, out you go?
No, absolutely not. You generally cannot use ground one in the first 12 months of a new tenancy.
12 months. That feels like a very long time if your personal life has suddenly taken a turn.
It is a long time, but it's about balancing the landlord's rights against the tenant's need for a stable home. The law is saying they should have at least a year of stability, and even after that, you must give 4 months' notice.
4 months. So wait, if I need to move back in, I have to wait a year, then give another 4 months notice.
Well, the notice can run at the same time as the end of that first year, but the tenant can't be forced out before that 12-month mark. So practically speaking, yes, the tenant is safe for that first year.
I can see why landlords are nervous. That's a huge lock-in period. What about selling? I know a lot of landlords are thinking of exiting the market. Do they have to sell with the tenant in place?
Not necessarily. This is covered by a new specific mandatory ground called Ground 1A sale of dwelling house. If the landlord intends to sell the property, they can seek possession to sell it vacant.
Yeah, I'm guessing the same lock-in rules apply.
You've got it. Can't be used in the first 12 months, and you still need to give 4 months notice.
So for anyone listening who's thinking about renting out their property for just a short stint of 6 months,
I would advise caution. This act effectively ends the idea of a short-term let in the private sector. You're really committing to a minimum of a year if that tenant wants to stay.
that is such a vital takeaway. Okay, one more in this bucket. Redevelopment. What if the house needs major work and I want to do a big renovation?
That would fall under Ground 6. If a landlord plans to demolish or reconstruct the property, and this is the key bit, the work is so substantial the tenant can't live there while it's happening, they can seek possession. Again, it's 4 months' notice for that one.
Now let's flip the coin. Let's talk about the things that keep landlords awake at night. Tenant conduct. Specifically rent.
The number one dispute.
Exactly. The rent stops, but the mortgage doesn't. Under the new system, how much debt does a tenant have to be in before a landlord can actually do something?
This is where we look at Ground 8. This is the mandatory ground for serious rent arrears. If the tenant owes a significant amount, the court must grant possession.
Define significant. Under the old rules, it was usually 2 months, wasn't it?
It was. That threshold has now been raised. The tenant must owe at least 3 months' rent if they pay monthly.
3 months. For a small landlord, 3 months of no income is a quarter of their annual revenue gone. That is a massive financial hit.
It is substantial, yes. The government's thinking is to prevent evictions over, say, a temporary cash flow problem. But you're right, for the landlord, the risk exposure is definitely higher.
And isn't there a catch about when the debt is calculated? I've heard stories about tenants just paying off a tiny amount to get around the rules.
Yes, that's a classic frustration. For Ground 8 to work, the debt must be at that 3-month threshold, both on the day the notice is served and on the day of the court hearing.
What about universal credit? We know benefit payments can be slow.
This is a critical point. The Act introduces a specific protection here. If the arrears are purely due to a delay in the government paying their universal credit, the court cannot evict under the mandatory Ground 8.
But hang on, how is a landlord supposed to know that? The DWP won't talk to them because of data protection. So a landlord sees no rent, serves notice, pays for court, and then finds out it was a benefit delay and the case gets thrown out.
You've identified a real friction point. It places the burden of investigation on the landlord. It really means communication with the tenant is more important than ever. You have to ask, is this a universal credit issue? Before rushing to court. Otherwise, you risk wasting a lot of time and money.
Okay, so Ground 8 is the big one for huge debts. What about the tenant who is just persistently late or always 1 month behind?
For that, you'd look at the discretionary grounds, specifically Grounds 10 and 11. Ground 10 covers any level of arrears, even a penny. And Ground 11 covers persistent delays.
But again, discretionary means the judge can just say no.
Exactly. The landlord has to prove a pattern of behavior. You'd need to show the court a schedule. Look, they paid late in January, late in Feb, late in March. The judge then decides if that's serious enough to warrant making someone homeless. It's not a guaranteed win.
Let's move from money to behavior. The real nightmare scenarios. Criminal activity, drug dealing, severe antisocial behavior. Surely a landlord doesn't have to give 4 months notice for that.
No, the law treats this very differently. For the most serious cases, we have Ground 7A. This is a mandatory ground for severe antisocial behavior.
What's the bar for severe? Is it just loud music or actual crime?
It's a high bar. It applies if the tenant's been convicted of a serious offense, has breached a criminal behavior order, or if the police have issued a closure order on the property.
In the notice period.
Theoretically, none. You can serve notice and apply to the court immediately.
Immediately sounds great, but does that mean the tenant is out tomorrow?
No. I need to manage expectations here. Immediate refers to your right to apply to the court. The court process itself still takes time, and strictly, the court won't make the order effective until at least 14 days after notice was served. So it's fast legal action, but it's not an overnight eviction.
That's an important reality check.
Yeah.
What about the lower level stuff? The tenant who plays drums at 3 a.m. or is aggressive to neighbors, not criminal, but awful to live next to.
That would fall under ground 14. This is a discretionary ground for conduct causing nuisance or annoyance.
And because it's discretionary, I'm guessing evidence is everything.
Absolutely. You can't just say, they're noisy. You need witness statements from neighbors, logs, recordings if you can get them. The judge needs to feel the impact.
I also saw a specific ground for domestic abuse, ground 14A. How does that work?
It's a really important safeguard. It's designed to let a social landlord evict a perpetrator of domestic abuse after their partner has fled the property for good. It stops the abuser from keeping the tenancy after driving their partner out.
That's a very necessary protection. Now, before we wrap up, two niche areas that are huge for some listeners. First, students. The student market relies on that September to June cycle. If students get indefinite tenancies, doesn't that break the whole model?
It was a massive concern. If students didn't leave in June, there would be no housing for new students in September. The whole university system would gridlock. So the government introduced a specific ground, ground 4A.
How does that solve the problem?
It applies specifically to student HMOs houses in multiple occupation. It lets a landlord seek possession to house a new group of students, but only between the 1st of June and the 30th of September.
So it basically enforces that summer turnover.
It does. But there's a condition. The landlord must have given notice in writing at the start of the tenancy that this ground might be used. You can't just spring it on them. And you must give 4 months' notice.
Seems like a fair compromise. The other niche is tied accommodation farm workers, caretakers, that sort of thing.
Yes, those fall under the Ground 5 series. Broadly, if the house comes with the job and the job ends, the landlord can seek possession to house the next employee. Notice is usually 2 months for those.
Okay. We've covered the list, we've got the buckets, the types, but I want to zoom out. Those so what question for our listeners. What does this shift actually require a landlord to change in their daily behavior?
This is the most critical takeaway, really. If people remember one thing, it should be this. We are moving from a notice-driven system to an evidence-driven system.
Break that down. Evidence-driven.
Under Section 21, it was a checklist. Did you serve the form, protect the deposit, give the gas certificate? If you picked the boxes, you got the house back. You didn't have to explain why. No. Serving the notice is just the opening move. You have to prove the content of the notice. A landlord's belief that a ground applies just isn't enough.
So, play out a horror story for me.
Yeah.
What happens if I get this wrong?
Okay. Imagine a landlord has a tenant who hasn't paid rent in 4 months. He serves a ground 8 notice. He waits the 4 weeks, applies to court, pays the fees. He gets to the hearing, and the judge looks at his paperwork and says, "Sorry, your rent schedule is messy. You missed a payment date, and you didn't check if it was a universal credit delay."
And the judge just dismisses the case.
Dismissed. He's back to square one. He has to serve a new notice, wait again, start all over. And all that time, the tenant is still there, not paying rent.
That is chilling. It really sounds like the era of the informal handshake deal landlord is over.
I think that's a fair assessment. Those informal arrangements become incredibly risky. If you ever need to use these grounds, you need a forensic paper trail. Rent schedules, written warnings, logs of conversations. Professional management is no longer an optional extra, it's the baseline.
And for tenants, I suppose this is the flip side. It means they can't be pushed out on a whim.
Exactly. It levels the playing field. A tenant can't be removed arbitrarily. The reason has to be lawful and it has to be tested. But, and this is important, it doesn't mean a tenant can't be evicted. If they don't pay rent or they behave badly, the grounds are there, and the mandatory grounds are very powerful. But the landlord has to be professional enough to use them properly.
It really feels like we're moving towards a much more professionalized sector. That brings us to the end of this episode of SanDemy. We hope this has helped explain how this part of the housing system works and why the changes matter in practice. This content is provided for general educational purposes only, does not constitute legal advice, and is not published on behalf of any local authority or organization. For specific situations, always refer to the legislation or official government guidance. If you'd like to follow the rest of this series, you can subscribe to the channel for future episodes. In the next episode, we'll look at how rent increases work under the Renters' Rights Act and how they can be challenged.